The 22nd of December, 1943, 28,000 feet over Kiel, Germany. A silver fighter banks hard through broken cloud, its long nose humming with a sound German radio operators have never logged before, not the flat drone of an Allison, but the deep, layered growl of a supercharged V-12, built 4,000 miles away and shipped across an ocean under U-boat fire. Below, a formation of B-17s continues on toward its target, untouched. Behind the fighter's canopy, a 23-year-old American pilot checks his fuel gauge and does something no Allied fighter pilot has done in this war before him. He keeps flying east, past the range of every other escort, past the point where the bombers have always until this exact moment been left alone. Frost forms on the inside of his canopy glass. His oxygen mask presses cold against his face. Somewhere below and behind him, a German fighter controller stares at a radar plot that doesn't make sense. The little fighters are supposed to peel off by now. Always have, every raid since 1942. They always turn for home before the bombers reach the interior. Not today. Today, the plot on the screen keeps moving east in formation, matching the bombers stride for stride, and nobody in that control room yet has a word for what they're watching happen. His name doesn't matter yet. Thousands of young men like him will fly this exact mission profile over the next 18 months, and most of their names have already been forgotten. What matters is what he's carrying, 2 75-gallon paper composite drop tanks bolted under his wings, tanks so new that ground crews were still arguing over whether they'd hold pressure at altitude. He doesn't know that the engine turning in front of him started life not in an American factory, but in a British drawing office a decade earlier. He doesn't know that the aircraft he's flying was, 18 months before, considered a failure. He only knows the bombers ahead of him have never had a fighter go this far with them. Today, for the first time, they do. He is 23. Before this war, he had never left his home state. Now he sits inside a machine assembled from parts stamped in 3 different countries, flying a mission that didn't exist as a tactical possibility a year earlier. He carries a survival kit, a silk escape map sewn into his flight jacket lining, a photograph he doesn't look at during missions because it breaks his concentration. What he doesn't carry is any sense of how unusual this moment is. To him, it's simply the job: fly to the target, protect the bombers, fly home. He has no way of knowing that historians will spend decades trying to explain exactly how the airplane under his hands became capable of doing what it's doing right now. This is not a story about an American fighter plane. It is a story about a marriage, a British heart transplanted into an American body, forged by an alliance so unglamorous it rarely makes the highlight reels, committee memos, licensing agreements, engineers arguing over supercharger gear ratios in unheated hangars. This is not a story about the P-51 Mustang. It is a story about how 2 nations, each holding half of a winning weapon and not realizing it, had to find each other before either one could win the air war. The Mustang did not win the skies over Germany because America built a better plane. It won because Britain and America stopped competing long enough to finish each other's engineering. To understand December 1943, you have to go back to April 1940 and further still, to 1933. When Rolls-Royce began designing an engine nobody had ordered. The company's engineers, working under Sir Henry Royce's successors, built the Merlin as a private venture, betting that Britain would eventually need a powerful new liquid-cooled V-12. That bet paid for the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And by 1940, the Merlin was already the engine that had helped win the Battle of Britain. That same year, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with an urgent request for fighters. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, made an audacious counteroffer. Instead of building an existing design under license, his company would design an entirely new fighter from scratch and deliver a prototype in 117 days. The result, the Na-73X, first flew in October 1940. It was fast, aerodynamically clean, and fitted with an Allison V1710 engine that performed beautifully below 15,000 feet. Above that altitude, the Allison ran out of breath. Its single-stage supercharger couldn't compress thin, high-altitude air efficiently enough to keep the engine's power up where German fighters actually fought. The early Mustang was, by 1942, a superb low-level reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft and functionally useless as a high-altitude escort fighter, which was the one job the war desperately needed done. It was a Rolls-Royce test pilot, Ronald Harker, flying an Allison-powered Mustang in April 1942, who made the connection nobody in an official planning meeting had made. He noted that the Mustang's airframe was better than the Spitfire's in almost every respect except engine altitude performance, and the Merlin, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, solved exactly that problem. His report went up the chain at Rolls-Royce with a recommendation that sounded, on paper, almost absurdly simple. Take the best airframe in the war and put the best engine in the war inside it. Nobody had done it yet, only because the two halves of that equation belonged to two different countries, two different air ministries, and two different industrial bureaucracies that had never been asked to merge a program this closely before. Rolls-Royce converted 5 Mustangs by hand, calling them the Mustang X. The improvement was staggering. Top speed jumped by over 50 miles per hour, and the aircraft's effective combat ceiling rose by more than 10,000 feet. Test pilots who flew both versions back-to-back described it less like an upgrade and more like flying a different category of airplane. The idea worked. Now it needed to be built at war-winning scale, and Britain alone did not have the industrial capacity to do that, while also supplying engines for its own Spitfires, Lancasters, Hurricanes, and Mosquitoes, all of which were already drawing on the same overstretched Merlin production lines at Derby and Crewe. Every engine sent to a Mustang was an engine not going to a Spitfire squadron defending British skies. The math simply did not close on British soil alone. That capacity came from Detroit. The Packard Motor Car Company, already a byword for engineering precision in American luxury automobiles, had been quietly building Merlins under license since 1941, a deal negotiated specifically to expand Merlin production beyond what British factories alone could manage. Packard didn't just copy the British blueprints. Their engineers redesigned components for mass production using American tooling standards, refined the two-stage supercharger for reliability, and integrated a new carburetor system. By the time the war ended, Packard and a second American manufacturer had built more than 55,000 Merlin engines on USK soil, a number that on its own would have made Packard one of the largest aircraft engine producers of the entire war, even though its name is barely remembered today. The redesigned P-51B rolled off North American's Inglewood line in the summer of 1943, its Packard-built V1653 Merlin turning out roughly 1,400 horsepower at altitudes where the old Allison had been gasping. Fitted with the new drop tanks, its combat radius stretched past 750 miles, far enough to escort bombers from English airfields to Berlin and back, something no Allied fighter had achieved before it. None of this happened without friction. American pilots who first flew the Merlin-powered version had to relearn engine handling from scratch. The two-speed supercharger shifted automatically at altitude with an audible thump that startled pilots used to the flat, predictable Allison. Ground crews trained on American engines had to learn British metric tolerances and British-style maintenance procedures almost overnight, translating manuals and swapping tooling in the middle of a shooting war. Quality control problems in the earliest production batches grounded aircraft for weeks, while engineers chased down supercharger seal failures. None of it was glamorous. All of it had to be solved before a single bomber crew benefited from any of it. Think about what that means for a moment. For 4 years, Allied bomber crews had accepted a brutal mathematical reality. Fighters could protect them partway to the target, then had to turn back, leaving the bombers alone for the most dangerous leg of the mission. In October 1943 alone, unescorted bomber losses over Germany reached levels the 8th Air Force could not sustain. The Merlin Mustang did not just add another fighter to the order of battle, it erased the gap that German air defense had been built to exploit. If this story matters to you, a like keeps it visible, then we keep going. There is a line from North American test pilot Bob Chilton, who flew the early Merlin conversions, describing the difference the engine made as immediately obvious. The first time the supercharger shifted into high gear at altitude, the airplane simply came alive, in a way the Allison version never had. It wasn't a subtle improvement. It was a different airplane wearing the same skin. The production numbers behind that transformation are almost as remarkable as the engine itself. North American's Inglewood and Dallas plants together turned out more than 150,000 Mustangs before the war ended, the overwhelming majority of them Merlin-powered. Packard's Detroit engine plant, converted from automobile production almost overnight, was building Merlins on a line originally tooled for the Packard Twin Six luxury car, a factory that had spent a decade perfecting smooth, quiet engines for wealthy customers, now building the most feared fighter engine in the European theatre. What should have been impossible retooling an American luxury car manufacturer into a world-class aero-engine supplier inside 18 months happened anyway, because the alternative was losing bomber crews faster than replacements could be trained. The Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Service at Rechlin routinely stripped down captured Allied aircraft, and downed P-51s were no exception, examined for weaknesses, armor placement, engine tolerances, anything that might yield a countermeasure. What they found was a machine built around an engine German industry understood well. The Daimler-Benz and Junkers design teams had studied British supercharger technology for years, and on paper there was nothing in the Merlin's metallurgy or architecture that should have been beyond German engineering to match or beat. What they could not counter was the range. Germany had built magnificent interceptors, the Bf-109, the FW-190 optimized for short, sharp defense of the homeland. No German fighter had ever been asked to escort bombers 1,000 miles into enemy territory, because Germany after 1940 was no longer fighting an offensive air war that required it. The doctrine simply hadn't budgeted for a fighter that needed to loiter over a target 800 miles from its own runway. That gap showed up in the numbers German fighter controllers watched grow worse through the winter of 1943 into 1944. Luftwaffe day fighter losses, once sustainable through attrition and replacement, began climbing past what German pilot training programs could replace. Experienced flight leaders were dying faster than new pilots could be trained to the standard needed to fight them. It was not a single battle that broke the Luftwaffe's fighter force. That winter it was months of exactly this pattern, repeated raid after raid, with a long-range escort now present for nearly the entire mission, instead of only the first and last legs. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself, questioned after the war about the moment he knew Germany's air defense had failed, didn't point to a battle or a bombing raid. He pointed to the sky over Berlin, to the day fighter escorts, appeared above the capital, alongside the bombers. That was the moment in his own post-war account he understood the fight was already lost. Not because the bombs had gotten heavier, because the fighters had learned to go all the way. What the German High Command never wrote about in its own official assessments was how simple the solution had actually been: not a secret weapon, not a breakthrough in MX, but an engine swap between two allies willing to share what the other one lacked. The men flying those long escort missions paid for every mile of that range. Second Lieutenant Robert Winks of the 4th Fighter Group flew some of the first Merlin Mustang missions over Germany, that winter in cockpits with no heat to spare once. The drop tanks were gone and the fuel math turned unforgiving. Frostbite at altitude was common. So was the quiet arithmetic every pilot ran in his head on the way home. Gallons remaining, miles to the coast. No margin for a dogfight he hadn't planned on. Some didn't make it back over open water. Their names are on cemetery walls in Cambridge and in Margreton. Ordinary young men who happened to be flying the airplane that changed the war, and who never lived to hear that it had. The bomber crews these fighters protected paid a cost of their own, even after the escorts arrived. A B-17 tail gunner flying his 11th mission, that same winter still had to sit alone in an unheated glass turret at -40 degrees, watching flak bursts walk toward his formation, trusting a fighter he could barely see to keep the German interceptors off his aircraft's tail. The presence of long-range escorts didn't make these missions safe. It made them survivable, a distinction that mattered enormously to the men living inside it, and one that's easy to lose in a story told 60 years later with the outcome already known. Casualty rates for the 8th Air Force's bomber crews remained brutal well into 1944. Even as fighter escort coverage expanded, the Merlin Mustang changed the odds. It did not remove the danger. If your grandfather or great-uncle served in this story, his name belongs in the comments. His unit, his theatre, what he remembered. Those details are the actual record of what happened. Back in England, the ground crews who kept these engines running rarely appear in the histories at all. Armourers, mechanics and engine fitters, many of them barely out of their teens, worked through freezing English winters, changing plugs, bleeding hydraulic lines, and coaxing Merlins back into service on turnaround times measured in hours, not days. A single engine failure traced to a maintenance error could cost a pilot his life over enemy territory. The margin between a mission that came home and one that didn't was often decided on the ground by someone whose name never made it onto a single official record of the battle. Germany never built an equivalent long-range escort fighter, not because German engineers lacked the skill, but because German air doctrine, shaped by short-range defense of the homeland and later by a collapsing fuel supply, never asked for one. No German factory ever answered the Merlin Mustang, not because the metallurgy was beyond them, but because the alliance that produced it was. Germany fought this war largely alone at the design table, dependent on its own industry, its own doctrine, its own supply chains, answering to a command structure that punished dissent from official strategy far more often than it rewarded improvisation. Britain and America, by contrast, had spent 3 years learning to hand each other their unfinished problems, a habit no Axis partnership ever developed with anything close to the same trust. The Merlin Mustang wasn't a triumph of raw invention. It was a triumph of two allies admitting, separately, what they couldn't finish alone and finishing it together. Somewhere over Kiel, that young pilot in December 1943 kept flying east, past every limit that had ever applied to him, carrying an engine built by two nations who had learned, just in time, to stop working apart. He would fly that same escort profile dozens more times before the war ended, and by 1945 the sight of Mustangs over German cities had become so routine that German civilians reportedly stopped bothering to note it in their diaries the way they once had. What was impossible in 1942 had become, by war's end, simply Tuesday.